Okay, today we're going to finish our discussion about fisheries, and then we're going to go on to energy. And in the analysis that we're going to do with regard to energy, there are a number of principles that we've developed throughout the course that we're going to apply. And in the application of those principles, we'll see again and again that one of the first lectures that we had in this course that focused on the core principles of microeconomics, one of those principles says incentives matter. Everything else in economics is commentary. Always keep in mind incentives. And if you ever get confused with regard to a problem that you're facing in economics, put yourself in the shoes of the decision maker. Always do that. And if you do that, that's the first step in doing the analysis correctly. Okay, now back to fisheries. If you recall, we ended the last lecture looking at a number of governmental policies that have been introduced for open access fisheries. Initially, the first policies were designed to increase the cost of various fishing operations, vessels, and in doing so, that clearly results in inefficiencies because there's an over-allocation of resources engaged in the process of fishing. Then we turn to a second policy instrument, namely taxes, in which the government, if it designs the tax policy correctly, the government can capture the scarcity rent. And as a result, there's no incentive for the individual fishing operations to go all the way to completely dissipating the scarcity rents. Remember, that point takes place where average revenues are equal to average total cost. And moreover, the scarcity rent is a concept that is used when we're looking at exhaustible or depletable or open access resources. But, as Amelia I'm sure can tell you, those scarcity rents are nothing more than economic profits, right? That's all they are. All right, so the third policy instrument that's out there that has been increasingly used in open access fisheries, and this is individual quotas, transferable quotas. The quotas come along to define a specific catch which is allowable for a particular species of fish. The government or the regulator that is assigned responsibility by the government sets the total allowable catch. Now, if it's transferable, that implies that those quotas can be bought and sold, right? Otherwise, it's not transferable. And as a result, let's look at a specific example. What would happen if these quotas were not transferable? Visit with your neighbors. Someone volunteer and tell me what would happen if they weren't transferable. And by the way, there are open access fisheries where governments or regulators have come along and defined such quotas and not allowed them to be transferable. Okay, Clifford, what happens? Say what? Dead weight losses? Right, but yeah, you're quite right. If they're not tradable, then they're locked in, right? They're attached to, say, the fishing operation itself, the firm. And the firm, even though the firm may be inefficient, that firm can't, for example, transfer their rights to some other fishing operation that is more efficient. You don't need to go to dead weight losses here, okay? Although there are dead weight losses. The fundamental point is that if they're not transferable, then there are no incentives that take place to transfer those quotas from the inefficient operations to the efficient operations. Clearly, if one operation is more efficient than another, its willingness to pay for the quota is higher than an inefficient operation, right? Secondly, if you're an inefficient operation, your willingness to sell is going to be larger than if you were an efficient operation. So you've got the basis for a benefit of the bargain, a mutual exchange, which is another one of our fundamental principles. Okay? And the bottom line is that if they're not transferable, then the catch, whatever's allowed by the government, will not be made by the most efficient fishing operations. And here's another way of saying what I just said, namely, if there's transferability, those quotas should gravitate toward those operations that are the lower cost operations. All right? Now, an efficient quota system has to have the following characteristics. And by the way, I don't mean this to be a memorization question, but remember when we discussed well-articulated property rights, there were three conditions they had to satisfy. One of those conditions goes directly to the previous example, namely transferability. What were the other two? Sorry, speak up. Enforceability and excludability and enforceability. If you satisfy those three conditions, then you have well-articulated property rights. Here, we're only focusing on the transferability, assuming that enforceability is satisfied and the exclusivity is satisfied as well. Okay, the total quota, adding up the quotas across each of the fishing operations, must total the efficient catch level. And that efficient catch level, coming back to our discussion on Tuesday's lecture, is cap E superscript Lilly, right? That's the point at which marginal benefits equal to marginal cost. And at that particular amount of catch, there are scarcity rents. Right? All right. All right. Now, the distribution among the benefits, whatever net benefits, depends on how the quotas are allocated. And if the government auctions off the quota, then the willingness to pay on the part of the efficient fishing operations ought to be whatever scarcity rents they can capture. And since they will continue to fish over time, you'd have to take the present value of those scarcity rents to those operations. But that would be their maximum bid in an auction, right? Does that make sense? So under those circumstances, the government, if it auctioned them off, would in fact capture the scarcity rents. However, that's typically is not what happens. Generally, because the fishing operations have been out there for a long period of time, and they basically argue, why should we give up all our scarcity rents to the government? Instead, the governments or regulators come along and look at some initial conditions, like what is the existing capacity, how many vessels does a particular fishing operation have, what is their historical catch. Let's allocate the available quota on the basis of their capacity and or their historical catch. And then under those circumstances, the scarcity rents will be captured by the fishing operations, not the government. However, this invites another problem. If it's an open access resource, and before the regulator comes along and imposes these quotas, if it's open access, there's too many resources, too much capacity that is involved in that fishery, right? Because they're going to be driving toward the complete dissipation of the scarcity rents, namely toward a point at which average revenue is equal to average total cost. To get to there's too much capacity in the industry. So what does the government do with regard to adjusting, or the regulator do with regard to adjusting for that excess capacity? Let's look at that question. Overcapitalization, excess fleets, too many fleets, and because of that overcapitalization, some adjustment has to take place if you're moving from an open access fishery to a fishery in which there are tradable quotas defined and implemented by the regulator or the government. Right? So one of the reasons for moving in that direction is because you want less catch to take place than would take place in an open access fishery. And the smaller amount of the catch is going to result in too much capacity still existing in the industry. So what have regulators or governments attempted to do? What they have done is try to design incentives for exit from the industry, to get rid of some of that excess capacity, to restructure the number of fishing operations, to reduce the number of fishers that are out there. So in many cases, to provide those incentives for exits, the regulator governments have come along and offered subsidies. And the subsidies have been designed to create some exit and adjustment in the available capacity with regard to a particular fishery. And this is voluntary, quite obviously. And, well, it's voluntary certainly in countries like the United States that has a constitution that doesn't allow it to be mandatory. There are some countries in which that isn't true, and you can, in fact, make it mandatory, but then the question is how would the government go about deciding who should exit and who should remain? Because those that are going to remain are going to be capturing the scarcity rent, and those who are forced to depart will no longer have the opportunity to capture that scarcity rent. Clearly, it can be self-financing in the sense that if you restrict the amount of capacity, now you've got scarcity rents that are available. You could use those scarcity rents to be the basis for subsidizing those fishing operations that are going to exit from the industry. Now, okay, so that's an overview of the policies that are out there. And along the way, when we look at Schaefer's biological growth curve for various fish species, one of the basic questions is whether or not, if you end up overfishing, that extinction emerges. Remember, that was one of the stationary equilibriums. Namely, if you look at the horizontal axis, recall that if that cap S is 0, you're faced with extinction. Now, fish are renewable resources. They're not exhaustible resources, but they don't necessarily reproduce if they become extinct. The classic example, passenger pigeons. Does anybody know anything about passenger pigeons? You're all too young to know anything about passenger pigeons. That was pre-post office. Yes. Right. They were a form of effective communication more than 100 years ago, simply carrying messages from a sender to a receiver, and they're now extinct. Now, inherently, whether extinction takes place or not depends upon the underlying science. What are the biological characteristics of the species in question? The issue about genetic diversity, anytime you end up with much less variation in the species, quite often it turns out it's more susceptible to extinction. And without question, open access, in contrast to private ownership, is more likely, certainly than private ownership, to lead to extinction. Why? Simply, private ownership, whoever owns that property right will have all the incentives in the world to conserve. Why will they have the incentives to conserve? Because they can capture the scarcity rents. Right? Okay, open access fisheries. One of the readings that you had for the lecture on Tuesday went to the unintended consequences of certain regulations. And this is a specific example. It's the swordfish fishery in Hawaii, where the fishery was actually closed down. It didn't specify, okay, you can only catch so much swordfish. It didn't allow any of the fishing operations to go out and actually collect swordfish. And as a result, why did they do this? They did this because the long line technology that was used by these fishing operations actually caught sea turtles into their nets, and those sea turtles were destroyed. The sea turtles are an endangered species. Hence, the government of Hawaii shut down the fishery. Now, did that result in more preservation of the sea turtles? Now, if the only fishery in the world were the Hawaiian swordfish fishery, and there was no other fisheries anywhere else in the world, then that's a distinct possibility. However, if the motivation for catching the swordfish is to satisfy demand by consumers for swordfish largely in the United States, because that's where all that swordfish ended up being consumed by the U.S. population, and if that fishery is closed, the supply of swordfish from Hawaii is not going to find its way into grocery stores or into food service to satisfy that demand. That swordfish has to come from somewhere else, right? And the somewhere else turns out to be the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, largely off the coast of Peru. And the question is, now there's more incentive for them, the fishing operations in that part of the world, to fish more. Did they take into account the endangered sea turtles, or did they simply destroy them much the same as the technology that was used in Hawaii? And it turns out in that article that this policy of shutting down the fishery, although it had great intentions, it turns out that the unintended consequence was that there was more harm done to sea turtles because of the increase in fishing that was taking place in the rest of the world. So that certainly was an unintended consequence and a transfer, if you will, of the damage or harm that took place with regard to sea turtles. Now, one of the market responses to overfishing has emerged over the course of the last 2 to 3 decades, and this is referred to as aquaculture. And in aquaculture, instead of natural habitats for different species, you have farming operations. You can go into any grocery store and you can buy farm trout, farm salmon, farm shrimp, and in each of those cases, that particular production operation is not open access, right? Because somebody has the private property right with regard to producing that substitutable source of fish, and moreover, that fish farming isn't susceptible to the complete dissipation of scarcity rents, right? All right, let's turn to energy. Now, a few preliminaries. Much of the work that has been done by economists in energy focuses on fossil fuel energy. The principal products are crude oil, natural gas, and there are other sources of energy, namely renewable energy, sun power, wind power, biofuels, hydrogen, a whole host of different sources of renewable energy, none of which are economically competitive with fossil fuels, unless you take into account the negative externalities associated with fossil fuels. And currently today, given the cost of those alternative sources of energy, even if you take into account the negative externalities associated with carbon emissions, possible global warming, even if you use a discount rate of 0 with regard to future generations, that even under those circumstances, those alternative sources are still not commercially competitive with fossil fuels. So it's a problem that's going to be with us for a long time. It's not going to go away, simply because of the fundamental economics. So it's worth looking at. So what questions do we want to investigate in this lecture? The first is natural gas. What happens, as took place here in the United States, when there are governmental ceilings that are placed on the price of natural gas? And the original legislation said the U.S. government will set, quote, just prices for natural gas. And when you look at this and you think, gee whiz, that sounds reasonable, right? If you could find prices that were just, or better yet, fair, then this is something that we can all embrace and adopt. But are there any consequences that adversely affect consumers and producers and the general society when such prices are set in terms of some regulatory body setting those prices? Will consumers suffer from the price ceiling, or will they gain? And on the surface, when you hear this, you think, they clearly gain, right? Because if the market price they would have had to pay is higher than the price ceiling, then they must be better off with a lower price. Sounds reasonable, right? And the general public, which don't have the kind of training that you all have in economics, you would have to educate them to explain that that's not necessarily true. And if you do that here in Berkeley, in whatever community you find yourself, they'll probably ask you to leave. How does the oil market behave with OPEC? Everybody knows what OPEC is, right? OPEC was introduced in the early 1970s. It's surprising, in the early 1970s, the watershed event that took place at that point in time that led to OPEC was Libya being taken over by Gaddafi. And he helped orchestrate the formation of OPEC. All right, other questions. How does the private market for oil, does it in fact, or does it not, result in too much consumption, too little domestic production, and too many imports into the United States? We're going to argue that it does all those things. So you don't want to rely just on the private market, right? And in order to achieve an efficient allocation of fossil fuels in the form of crude oil, what are the remedies that might correct for the negative externalities, particularly those that relate to national security? National security in the sense that if there's a major confrontation, for example, that's going on right now between Iran and the developed world, particularly the United States and Israel, and they shut off access lanes with regard to crude oil, with that kind of vulnerability, do we want to take into account correcting the incentives to adjust for that vulnerability? And similarly with regard to climate change, whether that's clearly a negative externality, which has been well documented, and how can we create incentives to counter those negative externalities? And then finally, what are the various sources of renewable energy? The core of this lecture, and what I'm going to hold you responsible for, is with respect to fossil fuels. Okay. Natural gas. Let's go back to the legislation that was passed in 1938 that established a clear mandate for the Federal Power Commission with the responsibility of maintaining, quote, just, quote, prices. And in maintaining those prices, what is the effect on consumer surplus? Does it in fact increase consumer surplus? What effect does it have on scarcity rent, and who captures that scarcity rent? Do producers of natural gas or the consumers of natural gas capture that scarcity rent? One thing is clear. By the way, what is the rule for dynamic efficiency? It's important to get to recall this at the outset because I'm going to start moving very quickly through some fundamental principles. And if you don't have this as a benchmark, an anchor, much of what we're going to cover today, you're not going to be able to follow. Dynamic efficiency is multi-periods, right? We're looking at multi-periods. And what is the condition that must be satisfied across all periods in the future for a particular the use of a particular natural resource? Yeah, by the way, this is what was covered in Burke's lecture. So he's responsible for the fact that